He left her for her best friend. No warning, no apology. Then he sent her an invitation to their wedding. But on the day of the ceremony, as they stood at the altar, the priest pulled out a letter. Not scripture, not vows, her words. What happened next made the entire room go still and sent the groom walking out. Alone, this isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about quiet dignity, unspoken truths, and a woman who didn't beg, didn't fight, didn't shout, but changed everything with 5 calm pages and perfect timing. What would you write if no one ever gave you the last word? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the kind that falls at night when the world settles, or the kind shared comfortably between people who know each other's rhythms. This silence was shaped like absence. He stopped humming in the kitchen. His shoes no longer squeaked against the tile when he came home. He didn't leave his keys in the bowl by the door anymore. He carried them in his coat pocket now, kept them close. At first, she thought he was tired. Work had been heavier than usual, and the winter months often made him quieter. But then the laughter vanished from his eyes. He still smiled mechanically at the right places in conversations. He still said, "Love you," out of habit at the end of phone calls, but his eyes didn't follow her across the room anymore. They didn't soften when she laughed. They didn't stay on her face when she spoke. It was like he was performing a role that no longer meant anything to him, going through motions that used to be sincere. The phone stayed, face down on the counter. Always, a shift from the way he used to leave it anywhere on the arm of the couch. On the nightstand, unlocked. Now, he kept it close, tucked into his jacket, on silent mode. One night, she heard a buzz from the pocket of his coat in the hallway. He moved fast, almost too fast, claiming it was a client. He never used to get calls that late. He was still present, technically. He still came home, still folded laundry, still sat at the dinner table. But the space between them had grown. Conversations thinned out. She'd ask how his day was, and he'd respond with single words. Fine, busy, long. Then he'd look down at his plate. Fork up, eyes down. She started talking more, to fill the silence, describing her day, telling little stories, hoping something would make him laugh. Nothing did. There was a moment, one small moment, when she realized it had shifted for good. She stood at the stove, stirring soup, wearing the same sweater he once said made her look like sunlight. He walked in, paused behind her. For a second, she thought he might wrap his arms around her like he used to. He didn't. He picked up a glass, filled it with water, and walked back out. No touch, no glance, not even a word. Later that night, she asked if he was okay. The question sat between them for too long before he answered. "Just tired," he said. His voice was flat. He didn't ask her the same in return. She began to catalog the details. His shirts smelled different, like a new cologne she didn't recognize. He started going for longer runs, even in the cold. His shoes were wet and muddy in the mornings, but his skin was dry, his hair too neatly in place. He came home later and later. Meetings, he said. Traffic. One night he forgot to call. Another night, he said he had turned his phone off to focus. She told herself it was probably nothing, that she was being paranoid, that it was just the ebb and flow of marriage, the slow stretch of time between comfort and complacency. But she knew, before she had any evidence, before anything was confirmed, she knew. Not because of what he did, but because of what he stopped doing. He no longer looked at her the way he used to. He didn't see her. He didn't ask about her. He didn't reach for her hand while watching TV. He didn't sit close. He didn't joke. The warmth was gone. Not replaced by cruelty or anger, just removed. Like someone had opened a window and let something sacred slip out unnoticed. That night, as she lay in bed beside him, both of them facing opposite walls, she stared at the blank space ahead of her and whispered, not loud enough for him to hear, "I miss you." He shifted slightly, but didn't respond. His breathing evened out, or pretended to. She lay awake until morning, and in the soft light of dawn, she knew something had already ended. Natalie had always been there, since college, since the dorm rooms with too many posters and not enough heat, since nights of ramen and whispered dreams at 2 a.m., they had come into adulthood together, matching outfits for job interviews. Late night, calls after bad dates, early morning walks after good ones. Natalie was the one who helped her pick out her wedding dress. She was the one who zipped it up on the morning of the ceremony, steady hands and eyes wet with joy. She was the first one she told when the pregnancy test came back positive, and Natalie cried harder than anyone when the baby was born. Over the years, life had shifted. Careers pulled them in different directions, but not apart. Even when they lived in separate cities, there were always catch-up calls, holiday visits, gifts sent on birthdays, and long voice messages filled with inside jokes only the two of them understood. When she and her husband bought their first home, Natalie helped paint the nursery. When her daughter said her first word, Nana, not Mama, to everyone's surprise, it was because Natalie had spent so much time with her those first few months. She didn't mind. She laughed, said, "I'll take it. She's got good taste." There was no reason to doubt her, ever. Natalie was the one person she didn't guard herself against. Everyone else had limits, compartments, boundaries, but not Natalie. She knew everything, every fear, every frustration, every argument with her husband. She had been there through all the hard parts and never judged, only listened. She was the first person she called when the silence in her marriage started to grow. Natalie had said all the right things. "You're probably just going through a rough patch. Have you tried asking him directly? You've always been stronger than you think." And so, she confided in her about the phone turned face down, about the missed dinners, the vague work excuses, the way his eyes no longer held her. Natalie listened, nodding, offering warm reassurances and tired wisdom. "Men pull away sometimes," she'd said. "Maybe he's going through something. Give it time." She wanted to believe that. She did believe it, because Natalie said so. There were small things she overlooked. The way Natalie started stopping by more often. The way her daughter clung to her, as if sensing something deeper than familiarity. The way her husband's eyes occasionally softened not when he looked at her. But when Natalie made a joke and everyone laughed. She remembered one evening, the three of them in the living room, wine glasses in hand. Natalie had said something about an old college prank, and her husband had laughed, not just politely, but freely, fully. It was the sound she hadn't heard from him in months. And she had smiled too, grateful for the moment, thinking maybe Natalie was helping in ways she hadn't expected. She didn't see it then, or maybe she didn't let herself. When the truth came, it didn't come loudly. It came in fragments overheard, phrases, a misplaced jacket, a silence that felt rehearsed. One night, Natalie's name lit up on her husband's phone after midnight. He said it was nothing. She didn't press, not at first. But the weight of unspoken things grew heavier by the day. When she finally asked Natalie directly, the answer wasn't denial. It was a long pause, a look, and then it wasn't supposed to happen. She sat very still. Her mind didn't race. Her heart didn't pound. It just stopped quietly, like a car engine turning off in a driveway. Natalie didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She said, "You know, I've always cared about him too." As if that made it better. As if years of loyalty, of whispered confessions and shared laughter could be redrawn like borders on a map. It wasn't just betrayal. It was displacement. The person she turned to when life felt uncertain had been the one undoing it all. Natalie had always been there. But now she didn't know why. She didn't plan the confrontation. It wasn't rehearsed, no long speech practiced in the mirror. It unfolded on a Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary weekday when the world feels too tired to break anything. She was standing in the kitchen, unloading groceries, a carton of eggs, a bundle of spinach bags she hadn't bothered to reuse. He walked in behind her, phone in hand, the kind of quiet that used to mean nothing. Now, it said everything. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Her back still turned to him. Her voice didn't tremble. It was low, even. He didn't answer right away. Just set his keys on the counter, too carefully. "Is there something going on between you and Natalie?" For a moment, there was only the sound of the refrigerator humming, then the sound of a drawer being closed. She turned to face him. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. He looked tired, or maybe just caught. He didn't look angry, didn't even look surprised. "It's not what you think," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "Then what is it?" He looked down at his hands, rubbing one thumb over the knuckle of the other, like he was trying to scrub the truth away. She watched him closely. He was good at lying when he wanted to be, but this wasn't a lie. It was Something worse. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said finally, "but it did." She let the bag she was holding rest on the counter. A bunch of parsley poked out of the top, green and fresh, like something alive had wandered into the wrong moment. "How long?" she asked. His eyes shifted left, then down. "A few months." She felt her throat tighten, but she held it. No tears, not yet. "Did you love her before you left me?" she said. "Or did you leave because you loved her?" He didn't answer, which was an answer. There was a knock at the door, soft, 3 taps. She already knew when she opened it. Natalie stood there, coat unbuttoned, hair down, no makeup, no smile. Just a shrug, as if even she couldn't explain what she was doing there. "I figured you'd want to talk," Natalie said quietly. The 3 of them stood in the entryway like actors in a bad scene each, aware of the other's lines, but no one wanting to say them. Her daughter was at a friend's house. The house was too quiet. She gestured for Natalie to come in. The ridiculous thing was that part of her still wanted to understand, still wanted there to be some version of this story that didn't end with the person she married and the person she trusted most standing on the same side of a line she never thought she'd have to draw. "I didn't plan it," Natalie said. "It just happened." That phrase again, like betrayal, could fall out of the sky. Like love was something that simply arrived, uninvited, and insisted on staying. "Did it mean something?" she asked. Her voice cracked a little this time. "Or was it just convenient?" Natalie looked down, her hands twisting in the fabric of her coat. "I don't know what you want me to say. I wanted you to say no," she whispered. "That there was nothing. That I was wrong." Number 1 spoke. He stood in the doorway to the living room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Natalie sat on the edge of the couch, not meeting her eyes. "You were the person I told everything to," she said, finally. "Even the parts of him I didn't understand. And you used that. You knew." Natalie flinched, but said nothing. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said again, softer this time. "Stop saying that," she snapped. "It didn't just happen. You let it, both of you." The room felt hollow after that. No screaming, no dramatic exit, just 3 people sitting in the middle of something broken, each one trying to decide whether silence was safer than truth. She wasn't expecting it to be that day. There had been no final argument, no slammed door or sharp words thrown across the room. Just a slow decline into silence, a few nights spent on the couch, and the growing awareness that nothing was being repaired. Still, she hadn't imagined it would be so clean, so clinical. She came home later than usual. Her daughter had gone to her grandmother's for the weekend, and the house was quiet when she stepped inside. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, hollow. The air felt different, like something had been taken out of it. She didn't notice it right away. She walked to the kitchen, set her keys on the counter, and opened the fridge out of habit. Then she turned toward the hallway and saw the door to the bedroom open wide. Her steps slowed as she walked down the hallway. Something felt off. The smell was different. Not bad, just emptier. When she stepped into the bedroom, it hit her. In fragments, the side of the bed was neatly made, flatter than usual. The corner of his pillow was missing the indent that always lingered after he got up. She opened the closet and found a third of the hangers bare. The empty space stood out sharply between her clothes, shoes gone. The watch box that used to sit on the dresser dash vanished. In the bathroom, his toothbrush was missing from the holder. She stood there staring at the empty slot, unable to move for a full minute. Even the little things had been taken. His shaving cream, his aftershave. The towel he always left crumpled on the hook. Back in the kitchen, there was a single sheet of paper on the table. At first, she didn't touch it. She just stared at it. Her name was printed at the top in bold. Next to it, his underneath, the word petition looked far too formal for what it was about to contain. She sat down slowly, as if her legs no longer understood their function, and began to read. It was what she expected. The legal language tried to smooth the edges, but it still cut. Division of assets, custody terms. The word irreconcilable appeared more than once, like a stamp on something spoiled. His signature was already there, neat, unshaken, as if he had been waiting a long time for the moment to arrive. He hadn't left a note, no explanation, no handwritten goodbye, just the formal letter of exit, notarized and impersonal. She ran her fingers along the margin of the page. Cold paper, ink that had already dried dot in the corner of the room. The laundry basket still held a few of his socks. Ones he'd forgotten, maybe, or maybe left behind intentionally. She didn't know which would be worse. She didn't cry, not yet. She stood, picked up the paper, and carried it to the bedroom. Laid it down on her side of the bed. It felt symbolic, or maybe just cruel. His drawer was empty. Completely, she pulled it open and closed again just to feel the motion. No old receipts, no coins, no loose buttons, just an absence that rattled Dot. Later that evening, she made tea, out of routine, not desire. She sat at the table where the paper had been and stared across at the empty chair. She thought of all the mornings they had sat there, the quiet ones, the tense ones, the ones where Emily babbled stories between bites of cereal while he sipped his coffee. With one eye on his phone, she wondered where he was now, with Natalie, probably, in some other kitchen, sitting at some other table. She wondered if he felt lighter, like someone who had dropped a heavy suitcase on the side of the road and kept walking without looking back. She folded the papers and placed them in a drawer under the phone charger. Not ready to sign, not yet, but she knew she would. There wasn't anything left to wait for. The room was colder than she expected, not physically, but in atmosphere sterile and overly quiet, the kind of space where voices never quite echo, only fall flat and fast against the walls. The conference table was too polished, reflecting. The light from the overhead fixtures in strange, sterile angles. The mediator sat at the head, flanked by a legal assistant who rarely looked up from her notes. Across the table, he sat with his lawyer, a woman in a gray suit with her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She sat alone, not because she didn't have representation, but because she didn't want to bring someone who hadn't lived in the house where Emily learned to walk. She didn't want another stranger explaining her child's bedtime routine in legal terms. She had memorized every detail herself. They'd already gone over the paperwork. The division of property was mostly settled. She had kept the house. He had taken his car, the savings account, a few pieces of furniture. She didn't argue over the couch or the espresso machine. What mattered sat outside the room, small legs swinging back and forth from the bench in the hallway. Emily waited there with a coloring book in her lap. Pink headphones covered her ears, though she wasn't listening to anything. She had put them on herself, a gesture that said, "I know this isn't for me." She'd asked earlier that morning why everyone needed to talk so much. "Aren't you? Both still my parents," she'd said, and no one had answered directly. Now, inside the room, the mediator was talking. "We've reviewed the preliminary custody proposal. At this time, we're recommending shared legal custody with alternating weeks and equal holiday distribution. That includes Thanksgiving, Christmas, spring break, and summer vacation." The lawyer on his side nodded with crisp professionalism. "We'd prefer Christmas to alternate by year, not by splitting the day. It's disruptive for the child." She nodded too, not because she agreed, but because fighting over a day already felt too small. The day wasn't what mattered. It was waking up to Emily's face in the morning. It was braiding her hair before school. It was helping her glue macaroni onto construction paper for a school project at 9 p.m. the night before it was due. The day was just a placeholder. "And what about the school schedule?" the mediator asked. "Transportation during handoffs." He spoke then. "I'll handle pickups from school during my weeks. I've already adjusted my work hours." It was the first time he'd spoken directly, and it hit her harder than expected. His voice still sounded familiar, still sounded like it belonged. In the kitchen, while breakfast sizzled, hearing it in this room, flattened by legal proceedings, made something small collapse quietly inside her. "Agreed," she said, her voice steady, even though her fingers were curled so tightly around. The pen in her lap that the skin had turned pale, her hands, which had always been firm steady through scraped knees, through toddler tantrums, through late-night fevers, were trembling now under the table where no one could see. But Emily had seen, through the hallway's open door. Looked up once, headphones askew just for a second. Their eyes had met, and in that look, everything inside her cried. She would not. "I think the proposal is fair," the mediator concluded. "Pending review, we'll prepare the official custody agreement for signature." The gray-suited lawyer nodded, and he said nothing. When they stepped into the hallway, afterward, Emily stood quickly, trying to read their faces. Her voice was small. "Do I still get 2 birthdays?" She crouched down, brushing a loose curl from Emily's face. "You'll always get more love than you can count," she said. "That's what matters." Emily nodded, and for now, that was enough. But her hands still shook when she rose, not from anger, not from fear, just from the quiet unraveling of a world she used to know. At first, she thought it was just timing. People get busy, plans fall through, messages slip between unread emails and half-finished to-do lists. The first time she noticed it was Emily's classmate's birthday party. There had been a group text, one she used to be part of, the kind that pinged relentlessly with snack signups and Pinterest crafts. This time, it never came. She found out through a photograph, balloons, cupcakes, a bouncy castle. Emily saw it too, on another mom's phone at pickup, and asked why they weren't there. She didn't have an answer ready. Maybe it was small, she offered, though the picture told a different story. Then it happened again. A coffee invitation she used to receive regularly just stopped. The women she had shared wine nights and school fundraisers with suddenly felt distant. Not cruel, not hostile, just removed. Like she'd stepped out of frame, and no one moved to pull her back in. Some tried to stay neutral. "We're still here for you both," they said awkwardly, as if splitting loyalty was as simple as dividing a dessert. But she saw the shift. She saw who still liked Natalie's photos, who tagged her husband in parenting articles and posted old group memories with casual nostalgia. The ones who stayed in touch with both ended up staying in touch with neither. Their silence didn't take sides. It just avoided discomfort. Then there were those who chose clearly, the friend who had held her hair back at a college party now sat beside Natalie at brunch. Another one, who once spent weekends helping her build IKEA furniture, sent a message that said, "I hope you can find peace with how things turned out." No one said the word betrayal. They didn't have to. It hung in the air behind their platitudes. She stopped trying to reach out. Every unanswered text, every vague response chipped at something inside her. Not just friendship, but trust. She couldn't tell where the judgment ended and the indifference began. Were they staying away because they didn't want to take sides, or because they quietly believed she had done something wrong? She started deleting names from her phone, not out of anger, just clarity. There was no point keeping numbers for people who flinched at her sadness, people who whispered to each other, "She's still not over it." Like grief came with a calendar reminder. The house got quieter. Fewer voices on the phone, fewer people knocking at the door. She no longer made extra coffee in the mornings, just in case someone stopped by. The extra cups stayed in the cupboard. Emily noticed, too. She asked why they didn't see Miss Carla anymore, or why Sarah's mom didn't come over like she used to. She asked if they'd done something wrong, and she told her no, because that was the truth. They hadn't done anything wrong. But in times like these, being blameless didn't always make you safe from distance. She filled the gaps in other ways. She joined a local book club with strangers who didn't know her marriage had ended. She started volunteering at the library once a week. There was something comforting about putting books in order, about touching quiet things with a known place. Still, the silence became familiar. Not painful anymore, just part of the background, like the creak in the hallway floor. Like the drawer that always stuck halfway, it lived with her. It didn't ask questions. It didn't pretend to understand. And in time, she stopped looking for old names in her messages. She stopped explaining herself. She began to understand that not all absences were betrayals. Some were just truths that friendships weren't strong enough to carry. It came on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between a bank statement and a flyer for gutter cleaning. A plain white envelope with her name printed in a formal serif typeface. But the spelling was wronged off by a single letter. Just enough to feel careless. Just enough to feel like a mistake that had once been familiar, but now came from someone who no longer cared enough to correct it. She turned it over. No return address, the flap sealed too precisely to be casual. She didn't open it. Right away, she left it on the counter beside the fruit bowl, the paper slightly curled at the corners. It sat there all evening, untouched, while she made dinner. While Emily practiced her reading at the kitchen table. While the house hummed with the soft routines of a weekday night. After Emily went to bed, she picked it up again. She ran her finger under the flap slowly, careful not to tear it. Inside was a thick cardstock rectangle, cream-colored with gold lettering, the kind that was designed to look expensive. A wax seal pressed into the corner with an emblem she didn't recognize. No photograph, no personal note. just the facts. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Natalie Christine Edwards and Andrew Thomas Lowell. Saturday, the 21st of May, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, St. Augustine Chapel reception to follow there was No with Love. No, we hope you can join us. Just a date, a time, and a location. Formal, clean, as if she were another name on a list compiled by a planner who didn't know the story behind it. Or maybe did and didn't care. She stared at the names printed in metallic ink. Natalie's name came first, Andrew's second, her best friend, her husband, or what used to be both. The room felt suddenly too quiet, like the air had dropped. Out of it, the kind of silence that follows bad news or heavy dreams. She read the card again, looking for something hidden between the lines. A hint of irony, a misprint, a message. But there was nothing. She wondered who had made the list, whose decision it had been to include her. Whether Natalie had typed her name in deliberately, or whether it had been passed along to a coordinator with no context. The misspelling didn't feel accidental. It felt like distance, like someone saying, "We had to send this, but not to you exactly." She leaned against the counter and looked at the clock. 9:42 p.m., she thought about the years, the ones where they had all shared dinners, holidays, beach trips, the ones where she and Natalie had once imagined being pregnant at the same time, laughing through swollen ankles and baby names. She thought of the night she told Natalie about her engagement to Andrew, the way Natalie had squealed and hugged her so tightly her earrings fell off. She remembered Natalie holding Emily for the first time, eyes shining, promising to always be her second mom, promising to always be there. The invitation felt like the final revision of a story she hadn't finished telling. Like someone had skipped to the end and changed the names without asking. She didn't cry, not this time. She just placed the card back in the envelope and tucked it inside a drawer, the one where she kept expired coupons and instruction manuals for appliances she no longer owned. It didn't belong in a memory box. It didn't deserve a spot among old photos and baby teeth and birthday cards from years when things still felt whole. The drawer closed with a quiet thud. She washed a glass, dried her hands, turned out the kitchen light. Upstairs, her daughter's breathing was steady and soft. The rhythm of someone who hadn't yet learned what an invitation can really mean. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the darkness thick around her, and tried to imagine what the chapel would look like, who would sit in the front row, what flowers they'd picked, whether the guests would smile politely, knowing or not knowing, whether Natalie would wear white without irony, whether Andrew would cry dot, and whether somewhere in the silence between vows they'd think of her at all. She noticed it immediately tucked into the bottom left corner of the invitation. Small print, almost easy to miss. But her eyes landed on it before anything else. Officiant, Father Michael Alden. The name didn't need context. She hadn't seen it in years, but it came back with weight, with warmth, with something else, to something harder to name. Her hand paused over the paper. She read the name again, slower the second time, as if the shape of the letters might have changed since the first reading. Father Michael, the man who had stood at the front of the small stone church the day she and Andrew said their vows. The one who had clasped their hands in his, looked them both in the eye and asked if they would promise before God, before their families, before themselves, to remain faithful, to love, to endure. He had worn white robes with gold thread that day. He had smiled gently as she walked down the aisle, his eyes kind but steady. Not the kind of man who rushed through words or read from a script without care. He spoke slowly, with feeling, like each line meant something to him. Like it wasn't just a ritual, but a bond being witnessed. It had been her idea to ask him. She'd met him through a friend from college and had always been struck by his calmness, the quiet steadiness he carried, not performative, just present. She liked that he didn't make marriage sound easy. During their premarital meetings, he'd looked at both of them and said, "Love is not a feeling you chase. It's a promise you keep when feelings fail." She remembered writing that down later. It had sounded more like a warning than a blessing. And now, here he was again, on an invitation for a wedding that would unravel the very vows he once helped. Kriechi sat down at the edge of her bed, holding the invitation loosely in one hand. It felt heavier now. Had he agreed to it? Willingly, did he know? Of course he knew. He had baptized Emily. He had blessed their wedding bands. He had come to dinner at their house once, years ago. and listened as they talked about future plans, children, travel, building a life brick by brick. He had nodded gently and smiled as Andrew poured him wine. She wondered if he remembered that evening, if he remembered what her voice sounded like when she was still hopeful, when she still believed in forever. And what would he say now, standing between them again, but this time with her best friend in the place she once stood? She couldn't picture it, couldn't imagine him repeating the same words to them. Do you take this man? Do you take this woman? As if nothing had happened, as if the previous vows hadn't mattered, as if the ceremony wasn't layered in the wreckage of what came before. Maybe he didn't know the whole story. Maybe they had told him some curated version. A relationship that fell apart, a new one that grew naturally out of shared pain, words people use to smooth out the betrayal. Maybe they left out the fact that she had still been married when it started, that Emily had been asleep down the hall, or maybe he did know. Maybe he'd heard everything and chosen grace over judgment. He was a priest after all. Forgiveness was part of his language. Still, she couldn't imagine standing in that chapel, hearing his voice familiar and measured say those words to them. She felt her chest tighten, not with rage, not even with grief, but with something quieter. A question she couldn't shake. Why him? There were dozens of priests in the city, hundreds of officiants, but they had chosen Father Michael. Or maybe he had agreed, and now the man who had once asked her to speak her vows aloud would be the same man to bury them. She stared down at the invitation again. The name printed in fine black ink, and for the first time since it arrived, she felt something new. Not pain, not shock, a pull. She folded the card slowly, hands steady this time, and slipped it back into the envelope. Not to forget it, but to decide what it meant that he would be there too. She stared at the invitation again, the edges of the envelope curling slightly now from where she'd opened and closed it too many times. The words hadn't changed, but they pressed harder against her each time she read them. The time, the place, the names, and, at the bottom, in careful black ink, the line that had lodged itself in her chest. Officiant, Father Michael. Alden, she hadn't seen him since Emily's baptism. Not in person, not in passing, not even by accident. And still, his voice had stayed with her. Not for anything dramatic, he'd said, but for the way he made silence feel sturdy, the way his words landed not with weight, but with understanding. She wasn't planning to call him, not really. The idea came without ceremony. One moment she was pouring coffee, the next her phone was in her hand, the number already pulled from the back of an old contacts list. She stared at it for a few seconds. Before pressing the green button, it rang twice. Then his voice, warm and unchanged. Hello. For a second she didn't speak, her throat tightened without warning. She hadn't expected to hear his voice to sound so exactly the same as if no time had passed. She cleared her throat. Father Michael, She stopped. You probably don't remember. I do, he said softly. Of course I do. The warmth in his voice didn't make it easier. It made her want to cry, and she didn't want to do that yet. She sat down at the kitchen table, one hand still wrapped around her coffee cup. I saw your name on an invitation, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. Andrew and Natalie's wedding. A pause followed. A real one, not polite, not nervous, just quiet. I see, he said. She didn't know what she expected him to say, some kind of defense, some gentle excuse about obligations or assumptions, but he didn't offer any. So she asked him directly, Do you know what you're doing? It came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't take it back. She heard herself clearly tired, too honest, too exposed. It was the question that had been building since the moment she saw his name on the card. It wasn't about whether he could officiate, it was whether he should. Another pause, then, would you come by the church? She didn't answer at first. She hadn't expected an invitation in return. She had only called to ask one question. But something in his voice, something patient and deliberate, made her nod before she even spoke. Yes, she said finally. Okay, they agreed on a time. Late afternoon, the chapel would be empty by then, he said. No rehearsals, no distractions. When she hung up, the house felt smaller. She looked around the kitchen, half expecting something to change. But everything was still in place, the cereal box on the counter, Emily's drawing taped to the fridge, the grocery list half finished beside the sink. The quiet held steady. It didn't judge, but it didn't offer comfort either. She looked at the envelope one more time before slipping it into her bag. She didn't know what she expected to find when she saw him. Clarity, maybe? Or something closer to permission. Maybe she just wanted someone else to feel the weight of what had happened. Not the betrayal, not the loss, but the hollow, echoing truth that promises could break and still remain printed in ink. She stood, grabbed her keys, and walked toward the door. The coffee had gone cold. The afternoon light spilled in sideways, warm but distant. The phone call had been simple, but it had cracked something open, and now, for the first time in weeks, she had somewhere she needed to be. The chapel doors creaked open with the same sound she remembered from years ago, that slow groan of wood and time. The afternoon light spilled through the high windows in streaks of amber and gold, softened by stained glass that hadn't changed since the day she walked down the aisle. She stepped inside carefully, as if the silence could break underfoot. Her shoes echoed faintly on the stone floor. She didn't go to the front. Instead, she slipped into the third pew on the left, the one she'd once waited in, veil draped behind her, hands clasped too tightly in her lap. That morning had felt full of breathless certainty. Now she sat in the same space, but the silence wrapped around her differently. It no longer felt sacred, just still. The smell was the same old wood, faint incense, candle wax. It brought back memories she hadn't asked for. The tremble in her hands as she held her bouquet, the way Andrew looked at her when she reached the altar, the weight of the vows spoken aloud under those high arches with Father Michael standing just a few feet away. Now, she stared at the altar as if it belonged to someone else's story. She didn't hear him come in, only sensed his presence. His steps were unhurried, and when she turned, he offered a small nod of recognition. He wasn't in robes today's, a simple sweater, slacks, and a coat that looked too warm for the weather. He carried a small paper cup in each hand. "I remembered you don't take sugar," he said gently, offering her one. She took it with both hands. It was warm, the heat pressing into her palms like something living. She didn't thank him. Not yet. He sat beside her, but left space between them. The pew didn't creak under his weight. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure I should," he nodded, as if he understood, and maybe he did. They sat in silence for a few moments, sipping slowly. The tea tasted plain and a little bitter, but she was grateful for the temperature more than the flavor. She looked up at the stained glass above the altar-rich blues and reds, framing a gentle Christ arms outstretched, the same window that had cast patterns across her wedding dress all those years ago. "Do you remember that day?" she asked Godfather. Michael looked ahead, not at her. "I do." She waited, but he didn't say more. Not right away. "I remember thinking how sure you both seemed," he added after a while. Not loud or dramatic, just ... Sure. She exhaled slowly. "I was," he nodded. "I believe that." "I didn't come here for advice," she said softly, not unkindly. "I came because ... I needed to understand how you could stand at that altar again." With them, he didn't respond immediately. She looked down at her hands, the tea trembling slightly. Her voice dropped. "You married us. You saw it. What we were, I did," he said, "and I still see it." She turned to him then. "What? Do you mean, I see what you brought to it, the weight you carried, the vows you kept even after the other person stopped trying?" The words didn't sting, but they settled into her chest with a strange heaviness. He looked at her then, eyes kind, voice measured. "I'm not standing there for them. I'm standing there for the truth that vows matter, even when they're broken." She blinked hard. "So you'll bless their vows, knowing what they came from?" "I'll witness them," he said, "but I won't pretend they aren't built on hurt. That's between them and God. But I wanted you to know I don't take that lightly." She nodded slowly, the silence stretching again. "I don't know if I'll go," she said. "You don't have to," he answered. "You've already lived through it. You don't owe anyone your presence." She looked forward again to the altar where she once stood and where another woman soon would. "I just wanted someone to remember what it was," she whispered. "I do," he said. And for the first time in weeks, she believed someone meant it. She wasn't looking for anything. That was the strange part, just trying to clear space. The top shelf in the kitchen had become cluttered cookbooks she hadn't opened in years. A binder of old takeout menus, some faded holiday cards she couldn't bring herself to throw away. She stood on a chair, pulling them down one by one, dust rising in soft clouds around her wrists. That's when she saw it, tucked behind a row of paperback cookbooks, nearly hidden where the cabinet curved. Into shadow was the journal. She recognized it instantly, the soft brown cover, the elastic band stretched loose with age. It had once been her favorite. The corners were curled, the edges stained from years of touching flour and oil with hands too eager to stop and wipe. Clean, she brought it down carefully, sitting at the table before she opened it. The elastic band snapped with a soft, tired flick. She turned the first page. Her handwriting stared back at her, looping and hopeful. Dark ink, still legible, though the paper had yellowed at the corners. On the inside cover, she'd written a quote in tiny block letters, "Begin as you mean to go on." It had been a wedding gift to herself, a place to record the small, everyday things that no one else would see. Their first grocery lists as a married couple, recipes she'd wanted to try, thoughts she didn't always say aloud. And as she turned the pages, she found something else lists, dozens of them things he loved. The first list was short, scribbled in the margin between a note about dinner and a grocery run. Things Andrew loves: Earl Grey tea, flannel sheets, the smell of pine, jazz on vinyl, early mornings, my hair in a braid, crossword puzzles. She stared at the words for a long time. More pages followed. Entries from their first year when everything still felt fragile but exciting. A note about the time he surprised her with a lemon tart after a hard week. A description of the way he looked at her when she fell asleep on the couch. A page where she'd written, "He makes the bed every morning, even when he's running late." I think that means something. She kept turning. There was a 2-week stretch around their first anniversary, where every entry ended with a single sentence, "Still choosing." Some pages were stained with splashes of tomato sauce, thumbprints of oil. One had a grocery list on the left and a paragraph on the right about how he danced with her in the kitchen without music. She could see it clearly, now his socks sliding on the tile, her laughter pressed into his shoulder. Then, gradually, the tone began to shift. Still warm, still loving, but a little quieter. Fewer lists, more questions. He's quiet lately. Not distant, just inside his head. I asked if something was wrong. He said no. I want to believe him. Later pages were nearly empty, a few entries with dates and no words. Then the last one, a single sentence, written in smaller handwriting. Than usual, I missed something, but I don't know what. She closed the journal slowly, pressing her hand against the cover as if to hold it still. Her tea had gone cold beside her. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, the late afternoon sun slanting across the floor in thin golden strips. The journal felt like it belonged to someone else, a younger version of herself. Someone who believed that love, written down, could hold a shape, could stay. But it hadn't. What remained were memories pressed into pages that no longer matched the life around her. She slid the journal back into the cabinet, but not behind the books this time. She placed it beside the flower jar, where she could see it when she opened the door. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because it reminded her of what she gave, not what she lost. The house didn't change when he left, not in the ways people expected. It didn't creak differently. The walls didn't suddenly feel more hollow. There were no dramatic shifts in light or silence. But there were small things, quiet, stubborn, remnants of his presence that stayed. She first noticed it when she opened the hall closet. A scarf had fallen behind a box of gloves, and as she reached in, the scent caught her off guard. His cologne, faint, almost gone, but unmistakable. Not sharp like it had been when fresh, more like a shadow of what once was. She leaned closer, breathing in slowly for a second. It was disorienting. Her body tensed instinctively, expecting to hear his voice in the next room, expecting the sound of keys, the weight of him moving behind her. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the soft tick of the wall clock in the kitchen. She closed the door and walked into the living room, where the pillows were still slightly uneven from where he used to sit. He always adjusted them, never said why, just moved them until they lined up perfectly at an angle only he seemed to understand. She'd teased him about it once, and he'd shrugged. Order, it's calming. Now, she left them where they fell. In the bedroom, one drawer always stuck. Not completely, just enough to resist the first pull. He had fixed it once, years ago, taken the track apart, realigned it, greased the runners. It worked perfectly for a while, then slipped back into its old habit. He said he'd fix it again. He never did. She opened it now and felt the familiar tug, the hiccup before it gave way. Her hand stayed on the handle longer than necessary. She didn't pull it all the way open. She just stood there, letting her fingers rest on it, as if the metal could give her some answer she hadn't found in words. There were more of these things. A window in the upstairs hallway that always fogged over when it rained. He used to wipe it clear with his sleeve and joke about the ghost that lived behind it. A loose floorboard near the back door he'd meant to glue down. A small chip in the bathroom tile from where he dropped a bottle years ago. He'd stared at it for minutes afterward, more upset than he should have been. She remembered touching his shoulder then, saying, "It's just a tile." Sometimes she caught herself reaching for things as if he were still there. A comment forming in her mouth about the draft near the pantry. A half-thought she'd want to share over coffee. But there was no one to finish the sentence with her. She found one of his sweaters in the laundry bin. Not worn, just misplaced. She held it in both hands, unsure whether to fold it or bury it. The fabric was softer than she remembered. It still held the shape of his arms when she hugged it close. Emily didn't ask about the little things, but once, while brushing her teeth, she said, "Why does the mirror still fog up, even if Daddy isn't here?" She hadn't known how to answer some days. She imagined the house as a living think-quiet, watching, holding its memories in its corners. Not haunted, just reluctant to forget. Like her, she didn't rush to change anything. The drawer would keep sticking. The window would keep fogging. His cologne would eventually fade. But for now, the house remembered. And so did she. It was a Tuesday night, the kind that passed without anything remarkable. Dinner had been pasta with too much garlic, Emily's choice. The two of them had eaten cross-legged on the floor in front of the television, a cartoon flickering in the background while she helped her daughter pick peas out of the sauce. Afterward, bath time came with its usual splashing and negotiations over hair. Emily had insisted on wearing the pajamas with the faded moon and stars, the ones a size too small that she refused to part with. The bedtime routine was familiar, predictable, teeth brushed, books read, blanket tucked under chin, a kiss to the forehead. The overhead light turned off, the small lamp on the dresser casting soft gold over the room. She was almost out the door when Emily's voice stopped her. "Mommy?" She turned, hand still on the doorknob. "Yes, love." Emily sat, up a little in bed, eyes wide, thumb curled around the edge of her blanket. Her voice was small but clear. "Will Daddy still love me the same?" The question floated between them for a second too long. It didn't break the silence, it deepened it. She walked back to the bed and sat beside her. Emily's face was open, expectant not, fearful exactly, but searching. As if she had already noticed things shifting, and this was her way of measuring them. "What makes you ask that?" she said gently. Emily shrugged in the way children do when they don't have the words. "He doesn't come for dinner, and he forgets sometimes. And Natalie picks me up, but doesn't ask about school." There it was. Not just confusion, comparison. She smoothed a hand over Emily's hair, tucking a strand behind her ear. "Daddy loves you," she said carefully. "That hasn't changed." "But it feels different," Emily said quietly, "like he's happy somewhere else now." It was hard not to flinch. Not because it wasn't true, but because she could hear the echo of her own thoughts in her daughter's voice. The difference between love in theory and love in practice. "He's trying to figure out how to be in a new place," she said slowly. "But his love for youth, that's something he carries no matter where he is." Emily looked at her. "Do you believe that?" She hesitated, not long, but long enough. Emily noticed, children always do. "I believe he wants to love you well," she said finally. Even if he doesn't always remember how, that seemed to land somewhere between comfort and confusion. Emily nodded slowly, but her thumb went to her mouth, something she hadn't done in months. A small regression. A search for something familiar. "I don't like how Natalie smells," Emily said suddenly. She blinked. "What do you mean?" "She smells like flowers that make me sneeze. And her hugs are too tight." There was no malice in her tone, just observation. Honest, unfiltered. It made her chest ache. "I'll talk to Daddy about the hugs," she said, "and maybe the flowers." "Emily, nodded again, and turned onto her side, curling into the blanket. The question hung there, still unfinished. Will Daddy still love me the same? It wasn't about bedtime visits or pickup times. It was about consistency, presence, the kind of love that doesn't have to be asked for. She sat there for a moment, longer, brushing a hand over her daughter's shoulder, unsure whether her words had helped or just softened the surface of something deeper. When she finally stood to leave, Emily was already half asleep. But just before the door clicked shut, her daughter's voice came again, muffled through the blanket. I love you the same every day. And in that moment, she didn't need any other answer. She wasn't expecting anyone. The day had been quiet, gray, the kind that settles over everything like a damp cloth. Rain tapped gently on the windows, not hard enough to demand attention, just enough to remind her of its presence. She had spent the morning folding laundry, reordering the pantry, wiping down forgotten corners of the kitchen, tasks that didn't need doing, but kept her from thinking too long in one place. When the doorbell rang, she thought it might be a package books for Emily, maybe, or the neighbor returning the umbrella she'd left on the porch. She didn't rush. She wiped her hands on a towel, checked the oven out of habit, and only then walked to the door. She opened it, hand froze, Natalie standing there as if she had every right to be. Her hair pulled into the loose bun she always wore when she wanted. To look effortless, one hand wrapped around the strap of her bag, the other hanging by her side. No umbrella, no visible discomfort, just a half smile that didn't reach her eyes. For a moment, neither of them said anything. I didn't think you'd answer, Natalie said finally. She leaned against the doorframe, not moving to open it. Further, then why are you here? Natalie shifted her weight. I don't know, I wanted to talk. A pause. The rain picked up slightly, pattering more insistently now on the porch roof. Say what you came to say, she replied. Still not stepping back to invite her in, Natalie glanced down at her shoes, then looked back up, eyes searching. I didn't think it would matter. You weren't happy anymore, were you? The words landed like a slap. Not loud, not cruel, just wrong in the way that cuts deeper than cruelty. She blinked. Is that what he told you? Natalie's mouth pressed into a line. It's what I saw. Saw when? She asked, her voice colder now. During the holidays, when you brought wine and offered to help in the kitchen, or on Emily's birthday, when you stayed late after everyone left. Natalie flinched slightly, but didn't answer. You didn't see unhappiness, she continued. You saw something you wanted, and you convinced yourself I wouldn't miss it. I didn't mean, Natalie started. Yes, you did, she interrupted. You meant all of it. You meant to lie. You meant to hide it. And you meant to marry him after it broke everything. Natalie looked down again. The rain had started soaking through her sleeves. Still, she didn't ask to come in. She didn't deserve to. I didn't come to fight, Natalie said softly. You didn't come to apologize either. Another silence. I thought we were friends, she said, not angrily, but with a finality that had been building for months. Not perfect ones, but the kind that lasted. Natalie looked up then, eyes tired. I thought so too. Then, how did you step into my life like it was yours to rearrange? Natalie had no answer, and maybe that was the truest part of it. The moment stretched between them, rain falling steadily now in the background. Somewhere behind her, Emily's laughter echoed from a cartoon playing in the next room. Life still moved, even when it didn't. Make sense? Natalie pulled her coat tighter and finally took a step back. I just thought you should hear it from me, she said quietly. That I didn't mean to hurt you, she didn't reply. Natalie turned, walked back down the steps, and disappeared around the corner without waiting for forgiveness. She stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold air curling around her ankles. Then she shut the door, not hard, not soft, just enough to remind herself that it was still her house. That some doors, once closed, didn't need to open again. The box was heavier than she remembered. It had been buried in the back of the closet, behind old photo albums, a pile of winter scarves, and the bin labeled Emily 2022 years. She hadn't touched it in years, not since they'd moved. Into the house, maybe not even then. It had been packed carefully, placed on a shelf, and left to gather dust with the things that once seemed permanent. She sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor, pulling it into her lap slowly, the cardboard soft at the corners from time. Her fingers hovered over the lid for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence for something that had once meant so much. When she lifted the top, the first thing she saw was the tissue paper creased and yellowing, still holding its shape around the dress like a cocoon. A age escaped as she opened it. Not musty, just old. Time had pressed itself into every fold. The lace appeared first, off-white now, not the bright ivory it had once been, but still delicate, still beautiful in its own quiet way. She pulled it out gently, letting the fabric unfurl across her lap. Beads clinked softly against one another. A few threads had come loose, but the shape remained. The bodice, the sleeves, the train she'd stepped so carefully not to trip over. It had been her mother's idea to preserve the dress, in case Emily wants it someday, she had said, back when that idea still felt like a future she could imagine. At the time, she had nodded, though the thought of anyone else wearing it had felt foreign. It was hers. It had been theirs, as she smoothed the fabric. Something slipped out from between the layers and landed beside her with a quiet tap, a folded piece of paper. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her hands. The edges were soft, the crease well worn. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her own. She unfolded it. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, written in blue ink, the kind that bled a little into the paper. It was dated 3 days before the wedding. If you're reading this, you're probably looking for something you've lost. Maybe it's your way forward. Maybe it's your sense of what was real. I hope this dress still means something to you even if everything else has changed. I hope you remember that you chose love honestly, that matters even when it ends. She read it twice. Then a third time, she didn't remember writing it. Not exactly, but the feeling came rushing back. The quiet hours before the wedding, the private worry that everything beautiful might also be fragile, the knowledge, even then, that certainty was something you made, not something that stayed on its own. She set the note beside her and laid the dress out fully. It spread across the floor like a memory she'd been avoiding. The fabric shimmered. Faintly in the afternoon light, it didn't feel like morning. Not exactly. It felt like holding something that once held her. She didn't cry. Not this time. She just sat with it. Ran her hand along the stitching, remembered how it felt to wear it. The weight on her shoulders. The way Andrew had looked at her when she walked toward him, eyes soft, a smile he couldn't hide. It wasn't a lie what they had, not at the start, and she wasn't going to let the ending erase the beginning. She folded the dress again, carefully, slipped the note back between the layers, closed the box, then she stood, carried it to the hallway closet, and slid it gently to the back again. Not to forget, but to honor the part of her that had once believed and the woman who still could. She wasn't expecting anyone, least of all him. The knock was soft but deliberate, 3 steady taps that seemed to know their place. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door, already preparing the polite smile people give to unexpected visitors. But when she saw who it was, she didn't speak. Her expression didn't tighten or falter. Just a long pause before stepping back and letting him in. Father Michael removed his hat gently and nodded, stepping into the hallway like someone entering a memory. He didn't wear his collar today, just a brown sweater with sleeves pushed up and the same old shoes he'd worn for decades. His hair had thinned further since the last time she saw him up close, but his posture was the same, upright but not rigid. A man used to listening more than speaking. "Tea?" she asked quietly. He smiled. "If you're having some," she nodded and walked to the kitchen. He followed, but stopped at the threshold, standing like he remembered the space from when it was full of different things, laughter, arguments, muffled through walls, the clink of dishes from 2 pairs of hands. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The hiss of flame felt louder than usual. They didn't talk while it boiled. When they finally sat down at the table, it was in the same chairs he'd sat in years ago when they'd invited him for dinner. During their first year of marriage, Andrew had made too much pasta. She had burned the garlic bread. Father Michael had said it was perfect. Now he wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at her with quiet familiarity. Not concern, just presence. "I hope it's all right," he said gently. "I was nearby and I thought, maybe you'd want company that doesn't come with opinions." She let out a soft breath. Not quite a laugh, but close. "I get plenty of those lately," she replied. Even in silence, he nodded. Sometimes silence is loudest. When people think they're being kind, they sat like that for a while, sipping tea, not filling the space unnecessarily. Finally, she said, "You knew him before I did." Father Michael tilted his head. "I did. What was he like?" she asked, not bitterly, just curiously. "Before me, he didn't rush to answer. He was younger than his years, always looking for something to prove, but not sure to whom. When he met you, that changed a little. He stopped reaching so far ahead. You grounded him." She looked down at her mug. "And then he forgot," Father Michael said softly, "or maybe he believed something else would make him feel that way again." There was no judgment in his voice, just observation. "Like weather being described." She nodded slowly. "Do you think people just change?" "I think people reveal parts of themselves when they're afraid," he said. "And sometimes they confuse escape with growth." She looked out the window. The street was empty except for a single leaf spiraling to the ground. "I thought we'd make it," she said. "So did I," he replied. They let that sit between them. No effort to soften it. "I found a note I wrote before our wedding," she said after a while. "To myself, about choosing love honestly." "That sounds like you," he said. "I don't regret it," she added, "even if he did." Father Michael reached for the sugar bowl, even though he never used it. "The way we love matters more than whether it's returned," he said gently. "That's what vows are, not predictions, commitments." She nodded again, this time more firmly. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the door. He turned before stepping out. "If you come to the wedding," he said carefully, "you won't be alone. But you also don't have to come to prove anything." She met his eyes. "I know." He placed his hat back on his head, nodded once more, and stepped into the cold. She watched him walk down the path until he turned the corner and disappeared. Then she closed the door. Not because she was shutting anything out, but because the room behind her finally felt like hers again. She began the letter in the early morning, before the sun rose fully, when the house still felt suspended between dreams and waking. The air was cold, the floor colder. She wrapped herself in a wool cardigan and sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Emily usually colored, where bills piled quietly in the corner, where toast crumbs always seemed to reappear no matter how often she wiped the surface. She pulled out a fresh sheet of stationery, one with soft edges and a faint floral border, a leftover gift from a birthday long ago. She didn't rush. She didn't even know exactly what she wanted to say, only that it needed to come out before the silence hardened around it. The pen hovered for a moment. Then she began. "Once said that vows aren't predictions, they're commitments. I've been sitting with that ever since you left. A difference is heavier than it sounds. I am writing this not for Andrew and not for Natalie. They have already chosen the story they want to live inside. I suppose I'm writing this because someone should know what I carried, what I chose, what I'm still choosing even now." The words came slowly, like pulling thread from a tangled spool, not angry, not dramatic, just honest. "When I married him, it was not to fix anything in either of us. I knew he wasn't perfect, he knew I wasn't. But I believed fully, stubbornly, that love wasn't about perfection. It was about staying when things weren't easy, about showing up in small ways. I thought if I held steady, we'd find our way through the rough seasons. Or maybe it wasn't. The truth is, I wasn't unhappy. Not the way Natalie said. I was tired sometimes, lonely, occasionally, but not unloved. Not until I was made to feel that way." She paused, her hand trembling slightly from the cold or maybe from the closeness of it all. She wrapped her fingers tighter around the pen and continued, "I found the journal from our first year. In the note I wrote before the wedding, the dress still fits. Not just my body, it still fits the memory of who I was. I am not ashamed of her. She believed in something I still believe in now, even after everything. This letter isn't meant for confrontation. I don't want it read aloud. I don't want it used. I only want it kept. Witnessed, maybe? I want someone to know I loved with my whole being, that I tried, that I remained kind even when it hurt to do so." She set the pen down and exhaled, her chest aching with the release of what she hadn't said to anyone else. There was more. She could have written about Emily, about the day she saw them together for the first time, about the sound of the house after he left. But some things didn't need to be captured. They lived in tone, in memory, in the way her hands folded the letter now with careful precision. She slid it into an envelope, sealed it, and wrote his name on the front with no salutation. Just Michael Dot by the time the sun had broken through. The window, casting soft light across the table, she had her coat on and the letter in hand. She walked it down to the rectory herself. No ceremony, just the quiet click of the mail slot and the sound of the letter landing on the wooden floor. Inside, she didn't wait. She didn't knock Dot as she turned to leave. The breeze caught the edge of her scarf and lifted it softly behind her. She didn't reach to fix it. Some things, she realized, didn't need to be held in place anymore. The delivery van pulled up just as she was returning from the market, brown paper bag in one arm, her keys still dangling from the other. She might not have noticed it if it weren't for the logo on the side, a small dove etched in gold beside. The words Petals and Grace, the same florist she had used all those years ago. The same one who had delivered her bridal bouquet to the church on that crisp September morning when everything still felt new. Two men stepped out carrying large white boxers. One of them asked, almost absent-mindedly, "Is this the side entrance for St. Jude's?" She nodded slowly, not speaking, just watching as they wheeled the flowers onto the church property. Through the narrow gravel path that separated her front yard from the rectory's rear, white lilies, cream-colored roses, sprigs of eucalyptus, and baby's breath curled delicately around the edges. She didn't need to see the order sheet to know what was inside the boxes. The arrangement hadn't changed. The same choices, the same combinations only. This time, they weren't for her. She stood at the edge of her porch for a moment longer than necessary, groceries forgotten in her arm, and watched as the doors opened and swallowed the flowers whole. The scent drifted toward her faintly, sweet, crisp, almost too clean. When she entered her home, she set the bag down and sat at the kitchen table, elbows resting on the wood, hands loose in her lap. A small petal had clung to the edge of her sleeve, white, thin-veined, soft as breath. She plucked it off and laid it gently on the table like a fragile offering. She remembered that morning so clearly now, the way her mother had helped pin her veil, the nervous silence in the car ride to the church, the way her hands had trembled as she adjusted the lilies on each pew. Needing something to do so, she wouldn't think too hard about what was coming. Andrew had said they smelled too strong, that they gave him a headache. She remembered smiling and saying, "Then it's a good thing it's not your bouquet." They had laughed, the kind of laughter that wraps around to people like a promise. She wondered if Natalie had chosen the same flowers intentionally, or if it was one of those accidental overlaps that sting more because of their thoughtlessness. She imagined the florist's suggestion. "This is what we did for Andrew's last wedding." Very classic. And Natalie nodding without hesitation, not bothering to ask what the flowers meant or how they once made her feel. There had been a time she believed flowers could mark a moment, a kind of living punctuation. Now, they felt more like a haunting. She made tea, poured it into the same mug she'd used on the morning of her own wedding. It had a chip on the handle now, a hairline crack near the base, but it still held warmth, still served its purpose. She sat back down and looked at the petal again. It was beginning to curl at the edges. Later that afternoon, as she walked Emily home from school, they passed by the front steps of the church. The doors were open. The air inside smelled like lilies, heavy and floral and too much all at once. Emily glanced up at her. "It smells like when we visit Grandma," she nodded, unsure what else to say. That evening, long after the sun had gone, down and the streets were quiet, she opened the back door and stood beneath the stars. The scent still lingered faintly in the air. She didn't cry. She didn't reach for the past. She just breathed it in once, then let it go. Some things could arrive without being invited, but that didn't mean she had to carry them inside. The town felt unusually still that morning, as if it, too, was holding its breath. The streets were empty except for the occasional dog walker or cyclist cutting through the early light. Even the usual hum of lawnmowers or distant radios seemed to pause. The sky was a gentle gray blue, not quite gloomy, but far from celebratory. It was the kind of sky that felt honest, neither pretending joy nor inviting sorrow. She stood at the window for a long time, a mug of coffee warming her palms, watching as nothing in particular moved. She hadn't slept well. Not because of nerves, not really. Just a persistent ache behind her eyes and a restlessness that had followed her through the night like a quiet knock she didn't want to answer. The dress she wore wasn't new. It was a soft blue, simple, with sleeves that fell just past her elbows and a hem that swayed slightly when she walked. She had worn it to Emily's school recital the year before. It wasn't chosen for the day, it simply happened to be what she reached for, comfortable, honest, like armor, without looking like it. She hadn't planned to go, not at first. When the invitation came misspelled, unsigned, smug in its blankness, she had nearly torn it in two. She had set it on the kitchen counter, moved it to the side table, placed it in a drawer. It refused to disappear, not because she needed closure, not because she wanted to witness it, but because something in her understood, quietly and without drama, that her presence mattered more than her absence, not to them, to herself. There was power in choosing to walk through a space meant to make her feel erased and remaining visible. Anyway, she didn't tell anyone. Not Emily, not Father Michael, not even her reflection in the mirror as she brushed her hair and twisted it back with a silver clip. She didn't need to explain it. Some decisions aren't made in words. She wore were flat, practical, the kind you could walk in for miles. As she tied them, she thought briefly of her wedding heels, now wrapped in tissue somewhere in the back of a closet. She wondered if Natalie would wear white, if Andren would cry, if anyone there would remember who stood in the same place before, them who had whispered the same vows into the same air. She didn't feel bitterness as she stepped outside, just a certain clarity, like the way morning light sharpens everything after a storm. As she walked toward the church, she passed familiar houses, waved silently at a neighbor, watering her plants. The woman smiled but didn't ask where she was going. There was a grace in not needing to say anything when the church came into view. The white lilies were already visible through the stained glass. She slowed only slightly, not to hesitate, but to observe, to take in the moment that had once belonged to her, now borrowed by others. She reached the steps and paused, fingers grazing the iron railing. The stone beneath her feet was cold, just slightly damp from the morning dew. She took one breath, then another. Then she climbed. No one met her at the door. No one stopped her or asked why she came. She slipped into a pew near the back, unnoticed by most, the same pew she had sat in when she'd worn white and trembled with hope. She did not tremble now. Her hands were steady. Resting in her lap, her eyes forward, she was not there to forgive. She was not there to protest. She was simply there, and sometimes that is the most powerful thing of all. The church was half full when she slipped in, late enough to avoid most eyes, early enough not to draw attention. The hush inside wrapped around her like fabric, soft, muted, heavy in its own way. Conversations near the altar were hushed and careful, spoken in tones that tried not to echo off the tall ceilings. Someone in the front row sneezed gently. A child whispered something too loud and was quickly hushed. The organist played something slow and reverent, as if even the music knew not to call too much attention. She found her seat in the last row near the edge, a small wooden bench with a slight wobble in the leg. She didn't mind. It gave her something to focus on, the tilt of the floor beneath her shoes, the way the cushion had been worn smooth by decades of unnoticed presence. From where she sat, she could see everything without being seen. The aisle stretched out like a memory, lined with white lilies tied in place with satin ribbon. She remembered tying those same ribbons once, years ago, her fingers trembling, not from cold, but from nerves. It hadn't rained that day. The light had filtered in through the windows, warmer, brighter. The same windows were there now, casting patterns of color on the polished stone floor. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had dot. No one turned around. No one looked back. Not Andrew, not Natalie, not even Father Michael, though she suspected he knew. His glance drifted once toward the rear of the church, just for a second, but he didn't react. He simply turned the page of his notes and continued. Waiting, she watched Natalie first. Her dress was pale ivory, not quite white, fitted in the way magazines like structured, but soft. Her hair was pinned in a loose updo, strands curled deliberately to frame her face. She looked polished, confident, the kind of confident that came from not expecting consequences. Andrew stood beside the altar, still a little thinner, his hands clasped in front of him, jaw tense. He didn't smile. Not yet. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he was remembering anything, whether the space between them, once filled with long evenings, shared glances across rooms, The quiet familiarity of ordinary love had shrunk to a dot he could no longer see, or whether, deep down, he still knew she existed in this room, breathing the same air, but he never looked back. And maybe that was the clearest answer of all. She didn't sit with bitterness. She didn't rehearse comebacks or imagine confrontations. She simply watched, observed, absorbed what it meant to be both forgotten and present. Two older women whispered beside her, discussing flowers or cake or something she couldn't quite hear. One of them wore too much perfume. The other wore a hat with a netted veil that dipped over one eye. Neither of them noticed her, just as she expected. A part of her had wondered briefly whether this would be painful, whether something inside her would crack open at the sight of it all. But what she felt wasn't pain. It was distance, as though she had stepped outside the life they thought they were living and seen it clearly from the edge. She didn't pity them. She didn't envy them either. There was a quiet strength in being the one who knew the full story. When the music swelled and the congregation rose, she didn't move. She remained seated, hands folded, eyes calm. From her position in the back row, she saw the moment Natalie took her first step down the aisle, the moment Andrew's shoulders shifted slightly, the moment his lips parted, almost but not quite, into a smile. And still, he never looked back, not once. Father Michael stood at the front of the church, his hands folded over the leather-bound folder that held the ceremony script. He had stood there many times before, officiating baptisms, funerals, marriages. His voice always calm, deliberate, steady. People trusted him to carry moments like these with grace. He never stumbled over names, never spoke too quickly. But today, something was different. He had greeted the couple with warmth but little ceremony. His words to Andrew were clipped, respectful but restrained. Natalie smiled too brightly, gripping her bouquet with fingers that twitched every few moments. The guests had settled quickly. There were murmurs of admiration for the flowers, the music, the bride's dress. Everything looked right. But there was something unspoken beneath it all. From her place in the last row, she watched the scene unfold. Her hands stayed in her lap. Still patient, no one turned to see her. But she saw everything. Father Michael opened the folder and began reading from the prepared script with the same practiced cadence that had comforted hundreds before them. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. His voice was clear, each syllable resting softly against the stone walls of the church. The couple faced him, standing side by side but not touching. Andrew's gaze flicked to Natalie, then back to the floor. Natalie looked straight ahead. A few more lines passed. The usual words about commitment, fidelity, the sacred bond of marriage. But then he stopped. The pause was long enough to be noticeable, long enough that a few heads turned. Even Natalie shifted slightly, her smile faltering. Andrew looked up, confused. Father Michael didn't look at them. Instead, he reached into the folder again, lifting a single piece of paper that hadn't been there when the rehearsal took place. It was handwritten, folded once, unfolded now with care. The silence stretched. Then he began to read. "This is not a correction," he said slowly, "but an addition. A voice that deserves to be heard today, even if it speaks from the back of the room." There was a rustle. Of surprise, whispers started to flutter. Natalie stiffened. Father Michael's voice didn't rise. It didn't accuse. It didn't falter. He simply read. She wrote, "I do not speak today to disrupt, or to haunt, or to claim what has already been taken. I write only to be remembered, not as a warning, but as a truth. I stood here once, in the same light, with the same flowers, speaking vows with the same man. I spoke them honestly, and even when he forgot them, I did not." The air shifted. It was no longer the wedding people expected. It was something else, now still quiet, but charged. Waited, but Father Michael paused again, then continued, "I do not write this to stop what is happening, but I hope, before these new promises are made, you remember the ones that came before. That broken things have weight, that leaving does not erase history, and that truth, once spoken, does not vanish even if it sits in the back row, unnoticed." There was no sound in the church. Not a breath, not a cough. Even the organist sat motionless. He folded the letter carefully, returned it to the folder without comment, and looked up. He met Andrew's eyes directly, and for a second, Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe? Or shame? Then he looked at Natalie, whose smile was gone, replaced by something more rigid, like a mask she didn't expect to wear so soon. Then Father Michael closed the folder altogether. "If either of you would like to proceed," he said evenly, "you may say your vows." But no one spoke, not yet. He looked out across the congregation again, but his gaze did not settle on anyone in particular. His fingers rested lightly on the folded paper in front of him, the one he had just read from. There was a stillness now, dense and unmovable, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. The church had always been a place of ritual, of order, of knowing what came next. But this wasn't part of the program. "I received a letter a few days ago," Father Michael said, his voice even, not raised, not defensive, simply steady. It was not addressed to either of the people standing here before us. It was addressed to me. A murmur moved through the first few rows, quickly hushed. Andrew's face had gone pale. Natalie glanced at him sharply, but he didn't meet. Her fingers tightened around the bouquet, and one of the roses lost a petal that floated down and landed softly on the floor. Father Michael opened the letter again and began to read, not from memory, not from judgment, but simply as a witness. "Before we begin," the letter said, "I want to make something clear. I am not asking for pity. I am not demanding justice. I am not writing this to interrupt what is already in motion. I am writing because silence has limits, and mine has reached its edge." She knew from her seat in the back that it was her voice they were hearing, not in volume, not in presence, but in tone. Calm, grounded, not angry, simply certain. "You both know who I am. You knew me before all of this. Natalie, you knew the names of my childhood pets. You held my hand when I gave birth. You brought me soup when I had the flu. You sat on my couch and said you'd always have my back. And Andrew, you were the person I believed in most. I saw your flaws. I never denied them. But I thought love meant staying even through the flaws." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man in the middle rose, glanced toward the back of the church, but saw nothing. Only a sea of heads facing forward, and a priest holding a piece of paper that made time feel slower. When I received the invitation, if that's what it was, I didn't intend to come. But something kept circling in my chest. Not bitterness, not grief, just a need to be present. I didn't come to stop you, but I will not let you rewrite the past to make your present more comfortable. Father Michael's voice didn't tremble, but it thickened slightly, like walking through a field where the air is suddenly heavy with rain. I gave everything quietly. I left space. I didn't chase or scream, but I was there. For every late-night call, every forgotten birthday that I remembered, every choice that led to this one. I was there, and now you stand here before these people, ready to build something new. You are allowed to, no one can stop that. But don't pretend what came before was nothing. Don't bury a decade beneath white lilies and call it clean. Eyes were fixed on the ground. Andrew stared straight ahead, unmoving. Only Father Michael's voice filled the room now. I loved, truly. I forgave quietly. And now I speak not to take back what's gone, but to say, I was here, I mattered, and I still do. He finished the letter and folded it again with care. Then he looked up. No one spoke, not a word, because the one who had been erased had just reminded everyone without raising her voice, without standing, what cannot be erased. No one moved after the letter was read, not at first. The words hadn't landed like a crash. They had arrived slowly, like a tide pulling at the edge of the room, quiet and patient. It wasn't a speech meant to destroy. There was no accusation, no rage. That's what made it linger more deeply. The pain wasn't loud. It was lived in. The letter, now resting in Father Michael's folded hands, hadn't even used their names often. It had referred to them in a way that made them feel like echoes, like people who had once mattered but now sat at a distance. Being reminded of something they hoped had faded, it began simply with a memory. One they'd both forgotten. "Remember the morning we moved into the house," the letter said. "We had nothing unpacked. You made coffee in a mug we'd wrapped in a towel in the suitcase. We sat on the bare floor, laughing, even though everything echoed. You said it sounded like the house was listening. It had been a quiet moment, one of many, but she had remembered it, because those were the things that stay when bigger promises are broken. The small proofs that it was real once, that it wasn't all a mistake. The letter didn't list betrayals. It didn't recount who lied when or who walked away first. It asked a question instead. When did we stop seeing each other? Was it slow? Or did I just miss the moment you turned your eyes away? It wasn't aimed like a weapon. It didn't pierce. It reflected, gently, relentlessly. Natalie stood still, bouquet now clutched in both hands. The silence of the room seemed to press against her skin. She didn't cry, but her mouth had gone tense. The air around her was different, not thinner. Somehow, Andrew remained frozen, his hands folded the same way they had been since the ceremony began. He hadn't spoken since arriving, and now, in the wake of words he hadn't expected, he seemed smaller, not because he was ashamed at least not visibly, but because, for once, he wasn't the center of the story. The letter didn't scold. It revealed there was a part near the middle that Father Michael had read more slowly. Letting each word settle, I watched you both make choices without looking back. And maybe that's your right. But when you erase someone who loved you fully, you also erase a part of yourself. The part that once held integrity, the part that kept promises when it was hard. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't ask for them to undo what they'd done. It asked them to see it. That was all. Just to look. To remember that love, when given freely, is not disposable even if it's no longer returned. She'd written it over 2 days, in the same kitchen where she once packed school lunches and folded shirts, still warm from the dryer. She'd written it with pauses, not edits, no crossed-out words, just the kind of clarity that doesn't need to shout to be heard. And as Father Michael reached the final lines, his voice didn't quiver. I am not here to disrupt your vows. I am not here to demand a seat, but you don't get to rewrite me. Out I existed. I loved, I gave, and I will not carry your forgetting. That was what made it powerful. It wasn't an attack, it was a mirror. And for the first time, they had no choice but to look. The room remained still long after the last line of the letter was read. It was as though time had chosen not to move forward until someone acknowledged what had been said. Not with words, not with applause, not with protest, just acknowledgement. But no one spoke. They all sat in it. Natalie stood next to Andrew, her face composed in the way people are trained to keep their expressions when being watched. Her spine remained straight, her bouquet held high enough to hide the slight tremble in her fingers. But her smile, the one she had worn through the walk down the aisle, the rehearsals, the photographs, even through the awkward greetings at the church doors, that smile had started to shift. At first, it was almost imperceptible. The corners of her mouth hesitated. Then the tightness around her eyes began to release, as though she could no longer keep up the effort it took to maintain the illusion. She reached for Andrew's hand, not quickly, but with the kind of motion that expected a familiar return. Something reflexive, like muscle memory. But he didn't move. He didn't take it. He didn't even look at her. His hands stayed clasped in front of him, the way they had been since the ceremony began. His jaw was locked, but his posture had softened not into comfort, but into something closer to uncertainty, as if something he hadn't prepared for had quietly walked into the room and sat down across from him. Natalie blinked, her hands still suspended between them for a second too long. Then she let it drop, subtly, not enough to draw attention, enough for anyone looking closely to see. The bouquet shifted with the motion, one of the roses tilting downward. Its stem no longer held straight. She turned her head slightly, stealing a glance at him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes gave him away. They weren't focused on her. They weren't even focused on the priest. They were fixed somewhere in the middle of the room. Somewhere in that letter, somewhere he didn't want to admit. His mind had gone. It was just a flicker, a brief shift of expression, a narrowing of the brow, a blink that lingered. But for Natalie, it was enough. She saw it. The doubt, not loud, not explosive, but present, alive. And once you see doubt in someone's face, truly see it can't be unseen. Her smile faded completely then. The performative curve of her lips dissolved into something raw. Her chin tightened, her eyes settled back. On Father Michael, who hadn't moved since folding the letter back into its place, he stood silently, waiting, giving them space, or perhaps waiting to see who would break the silence first. The guests had started to shift in their seats. Some glanced between each other. Others stole glances toward the back, still trying to understand the weight of what had just occurred. But no one said a word. It was as if the letter had laid something on the ground that no one dared step over. Natalie straightened again, her shoulders rising defensively. She blinked twice in quick succession, as if trying to shake something off. She adjusted the bouquet, cleared her throat faintly, but Andrew still hadn't looked at her. And now she wasn't sure he would. In that single flicker of his eyes, she had glimpsed something deeper than hesitation. She had glimpsed memory, and memory, once returned, has a way of unraveling the new narrative before it even begins. The silence grew thick enough to feel it wasn't the kind that simply filled a pause, it was the kind that pressed against skin, that made people sit straighter in their pews, unsure of what to do with their hands. Some guests shifted, some glanced sideways at each other, eyebrows raised, but lips sealed. Even the children, who moments before had fidgeted and whispered, seemed frozen in a stillness they didn't fully understand. Father Michael didn't speak. He stood with the folder closed in his hands, watching the man before him. The letter had been folded carefully and set back into place, but its weight had not been lifted. It still hung in the air, lingering like incense in a cathedral after the smoke has settled. A room full of witnesses waited for something, anything, a vow, a nod, a gesture, even a breath would have sufficed, but none came. Natalie remained poised, bouquet clenched tighter now, her fingers bone-white against the pale ribbon. Her gaze flicked between Andrew and Father Michael, searching for a cue. Her posture begged for momentum. The next line, move the moment forward, salvage the ceremony from whatever limbo it had fallen into. Andrew did not move. His eyes stayed low. Fixed somewhere on the floor between his shoes and the base of the altar, his shoulders had sagged slightly, not slumped, not defeated, just softened in the way a man looks when something inside has caved quietly. No drama, no collapse, just the silent folding of certainty. Father Michael gave him time, a generous amount, more than would normally pass in a wedding ceremony. But there comes a moment when silence becomes its own answer, and when that moment arrived. Father Michael gently closed the folder in his hands and placed it on the small wooden lectern beside him. Still, no one spoke. The action said what words could not. Across the pews, the guests sat unmoving. A few leaned toward one another in hesitant murmurs, but none dared interrupt the moment directly. No one stood, no one laughed to break the tension. The air in the church had shifted into something colder, not hostile, but hollow, as though a current had passed through and taken something with it on its way out. Natalie turned toward Andrew now fully. She didn't whisper, she didn't plead, but her mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again when she saw his face. There was nothing in it for her to reach for. No spark of reassurance, no shared smile, no invitation to pretend. It was all fine, just stillness. She took a step back without realizing she had. The edge of her dress caught on the heel of her shoe, and she had to steady herself. A petal dropped from her bouquet to the ground. No one moved to pick it up. Father Michael looked at Andrew one last time, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. Then he glanced toward Natalie, then toward the rows of guests. Then he stepped down from the altar, walked slowly to the pew, and sat. He did not declare the ceremony over. He did not continue it. He simply removed himself from its center. The silence remained, now thicker than before, not empty, but full of everything that hadn't been said. And in that silence, everyone knew whatever was going to happen next wouldn't be written in the program. He didn't say a word, not to Father Michael, not to Natalie, not to the quiet sea of guests who sat frozen in their seats, watching as the moment unraveled in slow, deliberate pieces. Andrew took one small breath, then stepped back from the altar, not hurried, not dramatic, but certain. The sound of his footsteps echoed more loudly than anyone expected in the high-vaulted space. They weren't heavy, just steady, shoes against polished stone, one after the other. As though his leaving wasn't a decision made in the moment, but something long set in motion, something that had simply reached its inevitable shape. Turned, watching him with her mouth parted slightly, bouquet now drooping in her hands. There was no outcry, no whispered plea, only a stunned kind of stillness, like a performer realizing too late that the script had changed and no one had told her. The guests did not stand. No one called out. There were no gasps, no protests, just eyes tracking the slow path of the groom walking away from his own wedding. Down the same aisle they'd both rehearsed just days before, where he was meant to return hand in hand. Under falling petals and polite applause, he passed pew after pew, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed ahead, not meeting anyone's eyes. The doors at the end of the church had been left slightly ajar from someone arriving late, and now the daylight from outside cast a faint path on the stone floor. It was toward that narrow band of light that he walked. Natalie remained where she was, facing the guests, now her figure caught somewhere between a bride and a statue. Her grip on the bouquet loosened, and several more petals fell, landing at her feet. Her shoulders, once proud and carefully arranged, had dropped. Her chest barely moved, as if holding still could somehow rewind it. As if any motion might finalize it, Father Michael watched quietly from the pew, hands folded in his lap. He didn't intervene, he didn't speak. There was nothing left to officiate. Andrew's hand touched the door, and for a second he paused. There was the possibility of a glance back, of a hesitation, but none came. He pushed the door open wider and stepped through, into the light, disappearing from view. Only then did the sound return, soft, scattered murmurs among the pews, people shifting in their seats. A woman reaching for her husband's hand. Someone setting down a camera they hadn't had the heart to raise. Natalie did not cry. She did not run after him. She simply stood there, framed by silence and memory. Every eye still resting on her, but unable to offer anything that could fill the space he'd left behind. One of the bridesmaids took a slow step forward, but stopped. When Natalie didn't move, no one knew what to do, because there is no instruction for a wedding where only one person walks out and doesn't look back. The car door shut with a sound that felt louder than it should have. She slipped the key into the ignition without looking up. The click and soft whir of the engine, the only sounds in the cabin. No music played, no GPS directions, just the steady hum of the car as she pulled away from the church, leaving behind white lilies, quiet gasps, and a silence that would ripple through town long after the last guest left. She didn't cry, not in the car, not on the steps, not when he walked away. Her hands gripped the steering wheel gently, but firmly, like someone threading a needle in motion. She drove through the old part of town, passing the bakery where she used to pick up fresh rolls on Sundays, the park where Emily learned to ride her bike, wobbling past each tree like it was a landmark. Traffic lights blinked through their routine, without much effort tread, green, yellow, as if the world hadn't just cracked open behind her. She passed a woman walking her dog, a group of teens skateboarding near the community center, a man watering his lawn with one hand while holding a phone in the other. None of them knew. None of them looked up. The church might as well have been 1,000 miles away. Her dress itched a little under the seatbelt. She hadn't thought about changing before she left, just walked out as she was, past a few glances that avoided her eyes, past Natalie frozen in place, past the flowers that no longer mattered. Her heels rested on the floor mat like stones, silent and unremarkable. When she turned onto her street, the houses looked smaller than usual. Or maybe she just felt larger, like she no longer fit into the version of herself that had once lived here. The driveway welcomed her without ceremony, the same oil stain on the left side, the same crack in the sidewalk where Emily liked to drop pebbles and pretend they were magic seeds. She parked but didn't move right away. Her hands rested in her lap now, fingers slightly curled. Her wedding band long gone, but the imprint still faintly visible. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at a scar you forgot you had. Then she reached over and opened the door. Inside the house, everything was still, not quiet in the way the church had been, but home quiet. A clock ticked softly in the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator, a breeze through the open living room window, stirred a thin curtain. Shoes were piled by the door. A cereal bowl sat in the sink. Life hadn't paused here. It had just waited. She walked in, setting her bag down gently on the bench. The dress rustled faintly. Her heels clicked softly against the floor. Sliver now. She slipped them off without bending down. Toe against heel, heel against toe. "Mom?" Emily's voice came from the hallway, uncertain but calm. "In here," she replied. Emily padded into view, barefoot, wearing mismatched socks and a pink shirt with marker stains. Her hair was a little wild on one side, her eyes curious but not fearful. "I couldn't finish the puzzle," she said, holding up a square board with one edge half done. "It's missing a corner." She smiled then, not because it was funny, but because it was real. "I'll help," she said. Lowering herself onto the rug beside her daughter, Emily sat next to her, handing her a piece with a tiny cloud on it outside. The wind rustled the leaves, and inside, a puzzle was quietly being put back together. The phone remained untouched for days, not because she was avoiding it, but because it never rang. No missed calls, no new voicemails, no buzz of a text from a distant cousin or curious neighbor, not even a polite message from one of the bridesmaids, attempting to smooth over what couldn't be smoothed. The silence held steady, blank, and unbroken, but it didn't ache the way it used to. She no longer checked it every few hours. No longer wondered if Natalie would reach out with some rehearsed explanation. No longer imagined Andrew stumbling through an apology wrapped in justification. The stillness that once gnawed at her now felt like a room she had finally locked. From the inside one, where she chose what was allowed in and what would stay out, the town carried on. Of course, people still picked up dry cleaning and brought casseroles to neighbors. There were whispers, certainly, but not to her face. Eyes that lingered a moment too long in the grocery store. A cashier who smiled with too much sympathy, but no one asked. Questions, not directly. No one dared enter the space she now inhabited, one carved not from vengeance or spectacle, but from quiet ownership. There was power in what she hadn't said. What she chose never to say, she hadn't told her friends the full details, hadn't retold the scene at the altar, hadn't listed the words from the letter, line by line. She didn't need to. The people who mattered had felt the shift. They saw the difference in her. In the way she moved through the world now, not louder, not brighter, just firmer, clearer, making breakfast, packing Emily's lunch, walking her to school, and waving from the curb. But there was something new in the rhythm of her days, freedom unspoken. She took longer walks, stopped for coffee without rushing, paused by the library, and wandered without a purpose. There was no longer a weight pulling at her steps, no one she was waiting on to come home, no one she had to brace for. The absence of noise became its own kind of conversation, one she no longer feared. What struck her most wasn't the betrayal, or the wedding that never was. It was how long she had lived in a house filled with unsaid things, unasked questions, unfinished sentences, and how those gaps had slowly replaced intimacy. She had learned to translate silence as peace, to treat distance as maturity, to accept withdrawal as patience. Now, standing alone in her kitchen with the sun warming the tile floor, she understood that silence had been hiding everything. But this silence, this was hers. She chose it. She filled it on her terms. She read more, sometimes just one paragraph before bed, sometimes whole chapters in the middle of the night when sleep didn't come. She pulled old journals off shelves not to wallow, but to remember who she had been before she became someone's afterthought. She found recipes she had never tried and burned 3 of them without guilt. Emily laughed through one of them, watching her mother hold a ruined pan like it was a trophy. On the 3rd day, she passed the church on her way home from the market. She didn't slow down, didn't look at the stained glass, but she noticed the lilies were gone. Just buckets of water left behind where flowers once stood. She wondered for a brief moment if anyone had gone back inside to collect what remained. A ribbon, a program, the memory of a ceremony that had turned into something else entirely. Then she kept walking. The silence walked with her, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. It was buried under warranty papers, takeout menus, and expired coupons tucked deep in the kitchen drawer she rarely opened. She hadn't been looking for it, just clearing space, making room for new things. Her hands paused when they touched the familiar envelope, its folds slightly softened from use, the ink on the front still smudged from the day she sealed it. Her name wasn't written on it. No one's was. It hadn't needed to be. She stood there for a moment, the drawer open, afternoon light pooling on the countertop, a kettle clicked in the background, forgotten mid-boil. Emily was at school. The house was quiet again, but not the brittle kind of quiet, just calm. She took the letter to the table and sat down. For a few seconds, she just looked at it. It had been months since the church, since the walkout, since the call that never came, and the questions that were never asked. Life had unfolded slowly in the meantime, soft weekends with Emily, steady hours at work, dinners that didn't feel like rituals, but choices. She hadn't forgotten the letter, but she hadn't read it again either. Not until now, she unfolded. It gently. The paper wasn't creased from anger or panic. It was smooth, the kind you hold with both hands. Her handwriting stretched across the lines, measured and calm. No crossed-out words, no rushed confessions, just truth. As her eyes traced the sentences, she didn't wince. She didn't brace herself. She didn't relive the pain. Instead, she read it like someone revisiting a story they knew ended exactly as it should. There it was, the paragraph about the little things, the missed glances, the quiet absences, the silences she used to excuse. The part where she asked, "When did you stop seeing me?" But not with anger, only clarity. The lines where she remembered the sound of laughter that stopped echoing through their halls. The way she wrote, "You did not destroy me. You revealed me too, myself." She hadn't known when writing it if anyone would understand, if Father Michael would read it, if Andrew would hear it, if Natalie would feel anything other than inconvenience. But she hadn't written it for them, not really. She had written it to play something down, to name the thing that had been hovering unspoken for years. Now, months later, she read those words and realized something unexpected. She was proud. Not proud in the triumphant, victorious way that stories sometimes portray, but in a quiet, deeply rooted way. She had spoken her truth when it would have been easier to say nothing. She had let go without fanfare. She had watched a room of people absorb the weight of her silence, and she had not needed to explain herself afterward. She folded the letter again carefully this time, like something worth keeping. She didn't cry, she didn't burn it, she didn't post it online, or frame it, or hide it again. She placed it back in the drawer. But at the very top this time, later, when Emily came home with a story about spelling bees and spilled paint, she smiled without distraction. She made dinner. She helped with homework. She laughed when Emily tried to tape a broken crayon back together and said, "It's still good, just a little bent." And something about that stayed with her long into the evening. That letter, bent in its own way, had once held all her pain. Now it held something else, proof that she had written her own ending, and that no one, not a man, not a best friend, not a church full of quiet watchers, had taken her voice. It arrived on a Wednesday. There was nothing unusual about the mail, just the usual stack of bills, a local flyer, and the slim cream-colored envelope tucked in between. No return address, just her name handwritten in soft ink. The letters slightly slanted, like someone used to writing on parchment rather than touchscreens. She knew the handwriting immediately. She stood in the doorway a moment longer, the morning air brushing against her bare arms. Emily's backpack sat by the stairs, already zipped and ready. The tea kettle was warming behind her, and in her hand, this envelope felt unexpectedly warm, as if it had been carried here with more care than usual. She didn't open it right. Away, she placed the rest of the mail on the hallway table, walked to the kitchen, and set the envelope beside her mug. The steam curled up gently, the smell of chamomile familiar and grounding. She sat down, no rush, no tension, just a kind of quiet knowing. The flap came open easily. Inside was a single small card, folded once down the middle, no signature. Number, ornate greeting, just 5 words, handwritten in the same ink. Some truths deserve to be spoken. She read it once. Then again, she didn't need more. The simplicity of the message carried its own weight, heavier than paragraphs. She thought of the letter she had written to Father Michael months ago, the one she hadn't read since until recently. She remembered the feel of her pen against the paper, the careful decision not to write out of rage, the choice to speak without bitterness. She hadn't known what he would do with it, whether he would deliver it or protect it or file it away in silence. But he had read it aloud, and now this dot, it wasn't a thank you. It wasn't permission. It wasn't even closure. It was something else entirely, a recognition that her voice had been heard, that telling the truth, her truth, had not been a mistake, that speaking when she had every reason to stay silent had not been an act of desperation, but of strength. She turned the card over. Nothing on the back. She didn't need more words. She already knew what she had said that day, and more importantly, she knew why she'd said it. Not to disrupt the ceremony, not to win him back, not to ruin anything, but to reclaim something, to hold a mirror to a moment and say, This is what really happened. This is who I really am, and I won't let silence rewrite it." She tucked the card into the kitchen drawer. Not hidden this time, just resting on top of the others above her own letter. Now carefully folded and easy to find out later that day as she walked Emily to school. She noticed something she hadn't before. The houses along the block still looked the same. The sidewalk still cracked in the same spots. But she walked differently now, not faster, not louder, just straighter, more rooted. And Emily, skipping beside her, asked if they could get library cards again. "You used to read me stories at night," she said. "Can we do that again?" She smiled, of course. Some truths deserve to be spoken, and some, like the stories read between a mother and daughter, need only be whispered. Because once spoken, they never really leave. They become the shape of everything that follows.